Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. My name is Adrian Goldberg. This time, tackling Trump's tariffs. You'll know the headlines by now. Donald Trump has launched a global trade war by imposing tariffs on America's trading partners. Chinese imports to the US will now carry a 34% tax. EU imports to the US, a 20% tax. The UK, a relatively modest 10%. Must be that special relationship. We've got a Canadian and an American with us. Canada, you may know, was previously targeted with 25% tariffs. The Canadian with us is Jen Hassum. Jen is the executive director of the Broadbent Institute, which is a social democratic think tank in Canada. We're also joined by Scott Lucas, originally anyway, an American, now lives in Dublin. He works at UCD Clinton, and he is a professor of international politics and US politics as well. So thank you both. Scott, you've got a view from both sides of the Atlantic, having lived in the UK for a good number of years. You're now in Dublin. So the UK is going to be hit with 10%. Ireland, where you now live, is going to be hit with 20%. And it all stems from the country that you were born in. We're not blaming you, don't worry. What sense can
Yeah, I like that when people come up to me and say, why are you putting tariffs on me? I got it's not me, mate. I got nothing to do with this decision. And it's Donald Trump and his merry band of certain advisors. And I think the way to start this off, and I'd be interested then to get Jen's feedback in it, is just the way that they did it, which just illustrates the madness of this all. We need to cut through that absolute train wreck of a 55-minute speech yesterday, which I think may have been the most economically illiterate speech I've ever heard a politician give. These are not reciprocal tariffs. And that's the first thing that we need to say, is that, for example, Donald Trump stood up there and said the EU, they had 39% tariffs on the United States. The actual figure, the actual weighted average of EU tariffs on US imports is 1%. He said, for example, Japan, 46%. The actual Japanese figure is around about 3.7%. At certain points, he just told outright lies. So, for example, Canada is putting 275% tariffs on US dairy products. And of course, the reality here is under the agreement that Donald Trump negotiated, it's 0% tariffs on US dairy products unless they pass a certain quota, which they haven't even come close to reaching. You can go on and on, but here's how they created that table, that chart that he held up. It had nothing to do with tariffs on US products. It had nothing to do with fundamental trade relationships. What they did is they took the total number of exports that a country sent to the United States. And then into that, they divided the trade balance for goods, not services, because the US has a surplus on services from many countries. And then they just took that raw percentage and they just threw it up on that chart, taking no account of services, taking no account of foreign direct investment, taking no account of free trade agreements, taking no account of the World Trade Organization. They just said, this is what we're doing. Absolute madness from an economic standpoint. From a political standpoint, what it illustrates is that these guys basically are now a shakedown racket. And I'm going to be honest with you. And that is, their interest is they want to get some money. They want to get some money and they want to pretend that these are tax cuts, when in fact, of course, they are tax increases. Because here's the stinger. As bad as the tariffs are for the global economy, to start off with, the United Kingdom companies don't pay those tariffs. Canadian companies don't pay those tariffs. The people who pay for those tariffs are American manufacturers, American farmers, American consumers. So Donald Trump, in effect, is punishing Americans for the sake of his bullying of former allies.
Why do you say it's a shakedown, though? Because in that analogy, the shakedown would be people giving money to Trump and his close band of advisors. In what sense is this a shakedown?
Well, it's a shakedown in the broader sense in terms of the way that Trump looks at the way that trade operates. Classical economic folks, and I'm trying to think back to my first degree at university, so forgive me if I stumble on this, but you try to think of it as a win-win situation. You try to think of it in terms of comparative advantage, right? So again, if we use the UK example, the UK has certain products like cars, like aircraft that the US can use. The US has certain components for manufacturing. They have certain agricultural products, and they have services that the UK can use. So everybody wins. Trump does not think of politics or economics as win-win. He thinks of it as win-lose. And that is, I have to take something from somebody. In 1988, he took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times where he said allies were ripping off the United States. He trashed NATO. He trashed Europe. I can't remember if Canada got it in the neck, but Japan and South Korea did. And he effectively said, that's it. Everybody rips us off, right? And he still thinks of that. And let me give you an analogy, Adrian, and then hand it over to Jen, the way I could finally explain this today, because I really like my colorful shirts, right? So my idea is like, Adrian Goldberg comes up to me and says, I've got this wonderful shirt you're going to want, Scott Lucas, and I'm going to sell it to you for 40 pounds. And I say, I like that colorful shirt, Adrian Goldberg. I'm going to take it from you for 40 pounds. And then I turn around and say to you, I'm running a trade deficit with you, Adrian Goldberg, of 40 pounds. You're ripping me off. I'm going to have to put a 25% tariff on you for selling me that shirt. And the end result of that is that the next shirt that you sell me, I'm going to have to pay 50 pounds for it. That, in effect, is what Donald Trump did yesterday on a massive scale.
We'll talk about how we actually deal with this in the EU and the UK. But of course, Jen, as a Canadian, you and your compatriots have had a few weeks advantage over us, for want of a better phrase, in that you've known that these tariffs are coming. And they have been described as hokey-cokey tariffs in, out, because he's imposed them, he's withdrawn them, he's imposed them again on both Canada and Mexico. What is the mood like in Canada? Has there already been any kind of pushback against Trump, or is there an acceptance that this is now the basis on which trade is done with the United States?
Very good question. And I would say both. There is both a pushback, and Canadians are blaming Trump for the chaos, for the worry, the fear of job layoffs, the fear of our economy getting wrecked, the fear of the prices of everything, and not just trade affected goods, but any corporation that wants to take advantage of a narrative that prices are going up can jack their prices. So there's tremendous fear, and the blame is being placed rightfully at the feet of Donald Trump. But there is also acceptance that there's a new world order that's being formed, and what Canada needs to do is shift our trade, which is 80% with the United States. Consider our national security, our foreign policy has largely been in alignment with the United States, for better, for worse, and to diversify who we're trading with, diversify who our strong relationships in this world are with. And we're looking towards France and the UK, who we have a historic relationship with. Canadians also look favorably towards Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, and to be looking for new partners, new allies. So this is the mood in Canada. At the hockey games, the American anthem is still getting booed. But at the same time, I think we're coming to terms with this new reality and looking for new partners.
And Canada has imposed its own retaliatory tariffs on the United States in some instances.
That's right. That's right. And that's why I think what we saw yesterday was Republican senators from places that are most affected by retaliatory actions from Canada were the ones who had the motion and voted with Democrats to try and exempt Canada from tariffs. So these are not progressives. They are dyed-in-the-wool Kentucky Republicans, but they needed to vote in that manner because it is their communities and jobs and incomes that are at risk, as is the case with people in Republican-led states or places that voted for Trump. So, for example, Stellantis, one of the big three auto manufacturers that has production in Canada, Mexico, and the United States, they are firing They are whole on firing people who produce cars in the United States. There are layoffs in Canada, in Windsor, at their plants right now, a 2-week layoff. There are layoffs in Mexico because this is the outcome of this kind of tariff approach.
The phrase that has struck me, and I apologize in advance if this is a cliche, because when we talk about the UK, we'll talk about what the UK could possibly learn from Canada or from the EU, is elbows up. Now, I suspect that Jen will already remember that. And I think the story of elbows up is a really interesting one here in terms of culture, because the stereotype, and forgive me for this, Jen, is that Canadians very nice, lovely people. They're not Americans, right? That's the, I used to put a Canadian flag on my backpack when I traveled to take advantage
You
of that.
were one of them who did that. No way.
Yeah,
I thought that was
exactly.
an myth. Scott,
No, absolutely right. Yeah, and so but what happened is that Canada before Wayne Gretzky has like this legend named Gordie Howe, and he's this extremely mild-mannered man off the ice. He's a devout Christian, lovely guy. He gets on the ice, and if anybody clips him around the legs or whatever, he runs them into the boards and he puts an elbow up into their jaw and takes a tooth out. And so that is the origin of the phrase elbows up. And all of a sudden, when Trump starts to try to slap tariffs on, you've got Canadians, including Justin Trudeau, the outgoing prime minister, when he hands over power, elbows up. And it's interesting that this notion of I think, and it's an interesting question to put to you, Jen, there is a level of sacrifice you're going to have to make here if you get into fronting up to the US. But I get the sense that most Canadians are saying, look, it's worth a sense of our economic sacrifice, at least in the short term, because if we don't do this, it won't stop. The old US-Canadian alliance is gone. And I think that's true in a wider sense. I think the US alliance with Europe, which we've had since 1941, I think that's gone as well.
Yeah, it seems to me that the UK stance is a much more conservative one. You may argue with a large C as well as a small C, even though we have a Labour Prime Minister in Downing Street at the moment in Keir Starmer. I'm not saying personally that that's necessarily wrong. I mean, the UK has had a less arduous tariff imposed, 10% compared to the 20% on the EU, but it is still a tariff. And there is evidence of some kind of personal relationship between Starmer and Trump. So I'm not going to be kind of sniffy about that. But in the long term, you have to say, well, does the UK have a special relationship with the US that is worth anything? Well, if it's only worth a 10% better tariff imposition than the rest of the EU, what kind of friendship is that? Is the UK better off doing what Canada is doing and reorienting itself towards Europe, towards Canada, towards Australasia, for example?
The issue here is that the UK is in a different position from Canada. And I'm going to start with this because some of the tabloids were driving me crazy today. Remembering I lived in the UK for almost 40 years, so I still have an attachment to it. And they're going, yay, yay for Brexit. Brexit has put us in this wonderful position where we only got shot in one leg rather than in two. And I'm going, no, wake up, folks, because what you're in the position of now is that you now are still facing not only 10% tariffs from the United States. Remember, you're facing 25% tariffs on automobiles, which is one of the major UK exports to the US. And you don't have a position within the EU to be able to have basically be part of a 28 nation response to this. You're on your own. And you're on your own when you have a massive Brexit sized hole in government revenues of around 40 billion pounds that still lingers. So you may not have the financial resources to take the US head on. And I think that's a large part of why the UK is being very cautious about this. The problem here is once the EU defines a position, and I think you'll see that by next Wednesday, because they have said they're going to make their response to the steel and aluminum tariffs. Once the EU defines a position, then the UK has to make a decision. And they have to make a decision whether they're going to come into line with the EU position or whether they're going to go it alone versus the States. And I think what Jim said is absolutely right, that the lesson of this is not some simplistic notion regarding Brexit or whatever. It's that countries are going to need to establish new relationships in terms of their trade, in terms of more broadly their economies, and in terms of their security. And that means the UK is going to have to be thinking, well, if you're not going to go into the single market with the EU, can you boost your trade with Canada? Can you boost your trade with Australasia? What type of opportunities do you have here? You cannot take a defensive position here. You have to go out and try to actually promote yourself in terms of an alternative to just relying on the US.
I have to say, I'll add to the elbows up analogy, and it is a common hockey directive that a coach would use and hockey, a lot of hockey has a value system and rule system that is not written down, that is implied and part of the culture. And it's a very tough culture. There's no diving like in other sports. I'll let you fill in the blank about what other sports you may think and your listeners I'm referring to, but there is no such thing. And so if the refs are lenient, you can get really badly hurt. And so if you're playing against a team that is known for aggression, in which the referees aren't going to be calling penalties because you know the culture of those referees, or you've ascertained that in the first 5 minutes of play, you're going to play elbows up, meaning that if someone's going to body check you, you have your elbows up and ready so that their pain is felt equally on the other side. And that's the nature of this expression in Canada that people are making signs about and rallying around. Because you're right, the Canadian people are ready for the kind of pain that this is going to cause. And it's going to cause deep and lasting economic damage. It cannot be resolved very quickly in the short term.
So there will be a period of economic turbulence. I mean, that seems unavoidable, but the possibility that somehow Trump might retreat, that we might then go back to business as usual, that is now being discounted in Canada, that the trust has been broken, not just with the president, but perhaps with the American people who, of course, have voted Trump in twice now. And Canada collectively is saying, you know what, we don't want to be prey any longer to the whims of this nation whose president arrogantly suggests that we might become their 51st state.
Yes and no. I think that a lot of people, and myself included, have been looking at is the impact of economic investment in the UK post Brexit. And that creates some hesitation when it comes to whether people should invest in the UK if there isn't these pre-existing and stable trade relationships. So that's the kind of lasting damage that I can see occur to our country. The second part around the American people, I don't blame the American people at all. I don't think Trump campaigned on this. I don't think there's wide economic literacy amongst any of our countries actually on the call that people would know what's the force and effect of these tariffs. And frankly, as someone who's progressive, tariffs can be a very good thing, not the manner in which they're being deployed right now, but we do want a system. We do want a system of fairness when it comes to trade. Absolutely, but not like this.
And Scott, that brings me, I think, to the potential appeal of this to Trump's base, not for 1 second excusing the bullying manner with which these tariffs have been imposed, but underlying it is a sense that globalism, as opposed to global trade, has failed many of the people who supported Trump. And it's failed people in the United States. It's arguably failed the working class in the United Kingdom. So that if you see your job offshored by a global corporation to a part of the world where labor is much cheaper, and you're told, oh, well, this is good for you because globalism will bring cheaper products to your doorstep. Well, if you haven't got a job, or if you've got a much less skilled job than you had before and therefore are getting much lower pay, it's hard for you to understand that advantage. And clearly that has been a phenomenon of globalism. It's been a phenomenon of globalism in the United States, in the US, I'm sure in Canada as well. And that's where there is a difference between global trade and globalism, and where Trump's tariffs, even if Americans don't all agree with them, where there may be a resonance with his base.
There may be a resonance with the base, but there are two levels here. The first is you have to get to a little bit of the reality of what is actually happening. You have to try to cut through the myths and talk about this. So for example, let's take the automobile industry. The decline of the automobile industry has a whole range of factors that you could talk about. One of them is that US labor cost became extremely high. Productivity went down in the US industry. The US auto industry did not adapt to changing demand where people wanted smaller cars. For example, from the energy shocks of the 1970s, the US cars did not adjust to changing standards on emissions, which is the reason why, for example, you don't get many American cars sold in Germany. It's not, as Trump said yesterday again, that they are banned in Germany. So the problems in the US auto industry were actually endemic within the industry, not like globalization came in and ripped all this up. But in fact, if you look at what happened to the US auto industry, is that it actually revived in the last generation in a couple ways. First of all, the whole point of the agreements, the trading relationships with Canada and with Mexico is that you had a relationship where you could have car plants being built in the United States, for example, and you could have components that were being built in Canada and Mexico, and that they would move across, right? So you had like a cooperative relationship to manufacturing. Secondly, you had a whole series of overseas car companies that began to build plants in the United States. I know this because I come from the American South, and a couple of them were in Tennessee, near where I grew up. Now, what Trump has done is ripped up that changes that had been taking place in the adjustments of the economy, because he slaps tariffs on Mexico and Canada. That increases the price of components. That makes it tougher to make cars in the United States. He makes it tougher for US companies to make cars in the United States, and he makes it tougher for Japanese companies to make cars. So they start thinking, we'll go elsewhere to make our cars. So it's a counterproductive measure. But the second thing is, Adrian, and I just got to kick back about this and so on, is that what has happened is that globalism, not as you have used it, but as the Trump people have used it, has become a slur to cover up their lack of understanding of economics. They will say, for example, that if someone is a globalist, they are conspiring against the United States. Now, leaving aside certain anti-Semitic elements, by the way, in that, which is also interesting, the fact what they're saying here is if you actually come and put the economic facts to us, for example, that trade is a win-win relationship, you're offending our notion of America first. So I think there are deep-seated issues in the American economy as it has changed over the last couple of generations. But here's the point I will get to get to where we are now. In November of 2024, Donald Trump owes his victory primarily to two issues, immigration and the economy, especially in the so-called swing states where manufacturing has been affected. Now, he gets a pass on immigration because the Biden administration actually brought it down 75% last year across the Mexico border. And because Trump will continue to put the myth, by the way, don't forget the myth that he put on Canada, why he put the tariffs on Canada, by saying that somehow Canada was like a source of fentanyl across the border, which is absolute nonsense, right? But the other issue that he won on in November of 24 was the economy. And when the economy tanks, it will not tank because the globalists are ripping off the United States. The economy will tank because Donald Trump has brought these measures in himself. And that raises my question. Does he back away from this and accept the defeat, try to reposition, or what I think is more likely, does he double down on blaming others and make this worse?
And the people who will lose out as a result of this, according to your analysis, are the very people who he says have lost out as a result of globalism or globalization.
Yeah, I think Jen has referred to that. What do we do for those people to get the message across that there is an alternative to the Trump way?
Yeah, I think that people are receiving that message, though. So some latest polling out of the United States is that 60% of Americans don't think that these tariffs are a good idea, including a majority of Republicans. This is unheard of. There's such very strong like party and partisan ties in America that it's typically always just a 50-50 split. But to see a majority of people who declare themselves to be a Republican who also think this is a bad idea, that's enormous. And the truth of the matter is that when there is free trade between Canada and the United States, what has occurred is that we're able to not just necessarily export our natural resources, which is the reason why we were colonized in the first place, but we also are able to create value add by having the kinds of infrastructure that is necessary to have manufacturing, to be turning and processing these raw materials into goods. And what I mean by that, and at the top echelons of power in Canada, and I work for the United Steelworkers Union, And when we would speak with the employer, who are foreign owned, why they're in Canada, largely, and this is where the progressive economic argument comes in. It's because our utilities are, for the most part, with some exceptions, publicly owned and operated. So they are not static price largely, and the prices increase only because of input costs. So it's cheaper electricity. And the second thing is, it is, even if the employees are being paid the same amount, it is cheaper to operate in Canada because we have a universal healthcare system. And so the employer doesn't have to pay the same level of benefits that they do per employee. And it's astounding the amount that they have to pay in the United States. So there is literally an economic argument that is formed because of these kinds of economic structures that we have in Canada, in which there's more government run programs and services, crown corporations that are advantageous to companies. If you can imagine this runs contrary to all of the kind of headlines. And so this is what's going to be required if we need to realign our economies. It's not just about making friends and greater trading partners, but it's also about identifying the areas in which the government will need to step in and fill a gap that may have been filled previously by a company in the United States or by the United States government itself. So if there's a part or a component or part of a processing line that needs to be filled, we're going to need to advocate for there to be a government intervention there. And it shouldn't just be a handout. There should be lots of strings attached, and or it is what we call crown corporations. So it is something that is owned and operated by the government and perhaps sold off later upon success.
Can I riff off that, Adrian, in two ways? I mean, first of all, with my new country, which is Ireland, there's a similar story here, because the Trump narrative, which I'm going to be honest, I find offensive, is oh, Ireland is ripping the US off, that term again, because US companies, pharmaceutical companies, high-tech companies have chosen to come to Ireland as part of what has been a very significant changing Irish economy in the 21st century. And just like Jen said, part of the reason why they're relocating, which the Trump people will never tell you, is, for example, is that healthcare costs are lower over here than they are in the United States. And because there is government support in terms of those companies, as they try to build up and invest capital and resource in here, the government tries to work with them. So that's actually something that should be celebrated. But Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, is coming around trashing Ireland and saying, you stole our companies from us. Now, why do I say that? Let me bring something in that I don't think is coming into the media right now, because everybody in Ireland is saying, oh, no, will those American companies go back to the US, right? Will they go back? At this current moment, Donald Trump's unelected co-president, Elon Musk, is ripping up government agencies that are providing the support services that Jen is talking about. He's ripping up the Department of Health and Human Services, which has either forced the resignations of or fired 20,000 of its employees in recent weeks. They are ripping up the Department of Energy. They are ripping up, of course, any type of environmental protections that are taking place. So the whole framework of government cooperation with businesses is being shredded right now as we talk about in the US. Yet Donald Trump comes back and says, we're creating an environment where all these companies are going to flock back to us, doing absolutely the opposite. And I think that reinforces the message, if we come back to the UK on this, is the UK needs to be in on this now. That the UK, which is really turned inward, with respect, it's my home or my old home, I love it very much, but it's turned inward. It keeps staring at itself. It needs to look outward in terms of how it's going to rebuild in terms of public services to try to attract foreign direct investment, instead of just simply going Brexit, no Brexit every day of every week.
Been a great conversation, Scott. Thank you. We'll speak to you again very soon, I hope. And Jen Hassum, lovely to speak to you again as well from Canada. And you have our best wishes. We're all in the same boat, really, now, aren't we? Canada, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and we can only kind of keep our fingers crossed for what happens next. But you'll both be welcome guests back again soon on the Byline podcast. And if you want to support our work here on the podcast, don't forget to take out a subscription to the Byline Times. It's our brilliant monthly news publication. You can get it at newsstands now, but it's better value if you take out a subscription. And in so doing, you'll also be helping to support our work here. Just head over to bylinetimes.com to take out a subscription. The Byline Times contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. So subscription details again at bylinetimes.com. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jen. And thank you for listening. Cheers now. Bye-bye.